In a 2014 lecture at the Game Developers Conference, former Hearthstone lead designer Eric Dodds talks about the importance of encouraging player stories in his games. Player stories, he explains, are anecdotes about a player's experience playing the game, as opposed to their interaction with the main narrative of the game's story. The example Dodds gives is playing a game of World of Warcraft with friends, in which they adventured all the way up to the top of the Sunken Temple dungeon, and instead of climbing down the opposite way, they decided to jump from the top into what seemed to be a pool of water below. Instead, they plummeted hilariously to their deaths in a puddle about 2 inches deep. Dodds recalls fondly how funny this was, and remarks that, for me, that was the story of Sunken Temple. Whatever intended narrative design was in this dungeon, it was less important than the completely unscripted mishaps he and his friends got into, the experiences that were unique to their playthrough of the dungeon. The scripted narrative seems to be completely secondary to him. A much better story had emerged from their experiencing the game in a completely unplanned and unforeseen way. In the lecture, he's talking about how player stories influence Hearthstone's card design, but the concept can just as easily be used to think about games as a whole. I'm sure everyone watching this has some insane story to tell about what happened to them in a game once, and there are loads of games that lend themselves to the creation of completely original player stories. However, rarely have my personal player stories ever had as much of an effect on me as the ones that developed while playing today's topic of discussion. As you might have already guessed, those games are Middle-earth: Shadow of Mordor and Middle-earth: Shadow of War. In most respects, the Middle-earth series are pretty average games. Set in J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings universe, they're third-person open-world action games with a combat system taken from the Arkham series and free-running that's sort of like Assassin's Creed, without the need to navigate or, think about where you're going. There's the usual 1,000 collectibles that reveal a little bit more about the game's backstory and world, and endless loot with different rarities that offer you little more than a slight attack or defense increase. However, perhaps the most mediocre aspect of these games is the story. I played Shadow of Mordor a few years ago now, and I could not give you one detail about the game's plot or the connections between its characters. Shadow of War I finished in only December, but I can already feel the paper-thin plot threads slipping from my mind like a fine mist. So forgettable was that game's storyline to me. And before you say it, it's not because I'm getting old. Don't say that. Never say that. But seriously, I really don't think it's any error on my part. I could tell you almost beat for beat what happens in the stories of my favourite games, and even if I couldn't nail the entire thing, I'd at least get the more interesting or memorable elements down. The Middle-earth games, not so much. The main character is a bland, brooding type, the elf spirit residing in his body is a high and mighty, power-obsessed know-it-all, and this lady is... she stabs orcs with her daggers? While they try to weave the narrative into Tolkien's universe in a way that makes sense, there are also bits that are kind of odd, even for me, someone who's not a die-hard fan or even a fan of Lord of the Rings at all. For example, the giant monstrous spider Shelob is apparently able to transform into a Morticia Addams looking femme fatale. I looked all around the Lord of the Rings wiki, and I couldn't find any evidence suggesting this was ever possible in the original canon. I understand taking a little bit of artistic license, but this bit stuck out as especially weird for me, and I can just imagine the Tolkien diehards sharpening their knives after seeing this twist. Generally, the game's stories revolve around warfare. They act as prequels, being set decades prior to the movies, and include familiar elements such as the Dark Lord Sauron's impending return, and his forces rallying to prepare for a climactic clash with the fate of Middle-earth in the balance. The plot beats don't really move too far past this premise. Every mission is you involving yourself in the battle in some way, killing important orcs, rescuing hostages, etc. I don't know if it's just me not being fond of war stories in general, but it never really lets up or does anything different. You're constantly in the thick mire of blood and orc guts, and everything just ends up feeling very repetitive. However, there is one very crucial element to the Middle-earth series that makes them so enthralling and ultimately so memorable. One main selling point that differentiates these games from your average third-person action game and makes them worth playing. However, more importantly, this element showcases the potential games have to tell stories in a compelling way, while not even needing to be entirely scripted. The mechanic is known as the Nemesis system. In the Middle-earth games, thanks to the magical elf Celebrimbor living inside his head, Talion has the ability to dominate orcs, the game's primary antagonists. Well, I guess technically they're Uruks, which are kind of a subbreed of orcs. I know it sounds nitpicky, but if I don't put that there, then I'm gonna get a snarky comment from someone. Domination can include simple, low-level manipulation, like stunning them or forcing them to fight against their immediate friends and allies, or more complex machinations, such as turning them into your personal war chiefs and using them to spy on their far more powerful masters, allowing you to pick apart the vast armies that lie in your way. So far, so predictable. You're manipulating hordes of faceless enemies to fight against other faceless enemies, right? Well, that's where the Nemesis system comes in. The orc army you're trying to take down is made up of a strict hierarchy, with leagues of captains reporting to war chiefs, who in return report to an overlord, who holds sway over an entire region of the game's world. Each and every one of these captains, war chiefs, and overlords, however, are completely unique to any one player's game, having a name, appearance, and various skills generated automatically by the game. With a few exceptions for story reasons, you will never meet the same orc twice across multiple playthroughs. Perhaps one of the best things about this system is that any orc has the potential to become a captain or higher, and thus take on these unique properties. If Talion is killed by a low-level grunt, that grunt will gain a name and title and become a captain within the orc army. Sometimes they'll even move further up the ranks, going from captain to war chief by slaying rivals within the army. They'll remember Talion from previous encounters, mocking him if he ran off in the middle of a fight, or reacting with disbelief if they killed him already. If you wounded them in a certain way, they'll even carry scars synonymous with that wound. The more you run into these orcs, the more you become familiar with them. As I was playing through the game, I'd frequently run into the same handful, either ambushing me or getting in my way as I raided fortresses, to the point that I remembered their names and appearances without the game even telling me who they were. This is a level of connection to NPCs that a lot of RPGs couldn't even evoke in me. But there was one orc that I remember most of all. One constant opponent that made for a far more menacing and personal antagonist to me than the main game's intended primary villain. And that orc was Azrans the Stitch. When I first met him, Azrans was a little more than a captain within the vast army of Saragost, having nothing much to him and little to pique my interest, besides the fact that, well, he was in my way. Wanting to weaken the area's army, I headed straight towards him, and after a close fight, he managed to beat me. To add insult to injury, Azrans even broke my sword. I liked that sword. So, after licking my wounds, equipping a new, better weapon, and bringing along a bodyguard this time, the two of us raided the party Azrans was holding to celebrate my defeat. It was here that I realised just how strong this orc was. He had a boatload of resistances, and my usual strategy of freezing an enemy, slashing them up, then looping the process just wasn't working, as he was immune to frost. Because of course he was. The fighting was fierce, and after tearing through hordes of party-going orcs, eventually it was just me, my bodyguard, and Azrans himself left standing. Things were looking rough, and it seemed like the monster was going to get another win. But eventually, we prevailed. After weakening him as a duo, it was my bodyguard that dealt the final blow. Well, Azrans, I thought, you were annoying, but you fall and die the same as anyone else. Or so I thought. A few hours later, in the middle of a raid on another captain's fortress, I heard a familiar growl, the guttural taunt of an enemy I thought to be long dead. That's right, Azrans had been stitched together and brought back from the grave to hunt me down once again. As if this wasn't bad enough, he'd somehow been training while in the afterlife, and had resurrected with a host of new abilities and resistances. While our fights before had been difficult yet close, this one was absolutely overwhelming. I tried to escape, but to no avail. Azrans had taken me by surprise, and managed to take me down. But this wasn't all he had planned. Little did I know, but he'd come back from the dead with grand ambitions, and just after killing me, Azrans took on the area's overlord, the Grand Commander of the region, in a duel, and slew him effortlessly. From the position of a lowly captain, this one orc had gone to the dead and back, grown strong enough to defeat me, and finally taken the highest position of authority in the area. I knew I'd need far greater strength than I currently possessed to get rid of my rival for good, so I spent time training. At level 37, Azrans was one of the most powerful orcs in the game, and it took plenty of leveling until I was ready to face him. I took down all of his warlords, broke through his fort's defences, and fought him in what I hoped would be our final confrontation. The fight was tough, even with my new abilities. The orc not only possessed immense power, but was also immune to execution moves, poison, and had massively enhanced health. All he'd have to do is yell "stars" and I'd be right back in Raccoon City. By combining every trick in my arsenal, I eventually managed to wear him down enough to shame him, reducing his level and banishing him from the fort. Now disgraced and weakened, my opponent had truly fallen from grace. I found him one last time in a mine within the mountains. After one final confrontation, I defeated and executed Azrans, severing his head from his enormous shoulders. Finally, this unstoppable, unkillable assailant had been driven from the game, for good. Except he hadn't. Inexplicably, Azrans rose one last time along with other rivals I'd fought throughout the game, as part of a mission involving a villainous orc necromancer, only now he'd come back as little more than a husk, powerful but absolutely mindless. It just wasn't the same as our previous encounters, and fighting this blank golem felt a little bit sad, honestly. I brought down my old foe, then killed the necromancer, ending the mission and finally laying the big guy to rest. This time, it was for real. Azrans the Stitch was no more. This triumph meant far more to me than completing the remainder of Shadow of War's dull story missions and beating the final boss. While I'd known the boss's identity and even encountered him several times throughout the game, fighting him didn't feel as rewarding and climactic as my final duels with the unstoppable Azrans. I didn't have as much of a personal connection as a player with the final boss, and the only satisfaction I felt from defeating him was the sense of satisfaction at having beaten the game itself. This sounds like I'm criticizing this final enemy, when in reality I'm only mentioning this to emphasize just how well the Nemesis system worked. Through purely AI-generated, non-scripted sequences, I now have a story to tell about an enemy that I faced as a player, who was my own opponent. Azrans will never again rise in any form in any player's game, and that story will never again be repeated. Side note, the earlier footage in my retelling of the story had to be taken from another similar orc. Only when Azrans defeated me, then became Overlord, did I know I had a story worth saving and telling. All early footage is just lost forever now. This experience doesn't just show how good Shadow of War's systems are though, it speaks to a particular way of telling stories that is exclusive to games and cannot be replicated in any other medium. I couldn't form this kind of connection with a character from a book or movie, a character that had personally slighted me and who I personally wanted revenge upon. A movie or book can't be built up as you go through it, and events can't happen in unexpected ways. That's not to say that other media can't have interesting villains or gripping plot lines, because of course they can. But there's something special about such an incredible narrative emerging from little more than pieces of AI working together with your input here and there. I imagine that if you confronted the game's writers with the claim that you enjoyed a completely auto-generated narrative far more than the primary one they came up with, they might feel a little bit of hurt pride. As someone who writes and designs games as a hobby myself, I find myself constantly struggling between what I want the player experience to be and the fact that I know players have to form these experiences for themselves. While actually making a game might be mostly on the developers and designers, the actual experience is collaborative. This is just what happens when you create something within a medium that's primarily interactive in nature. Gamers engage with the games that they play and bring their own personalities and input to those games. When games like the Middle-earth series not only encourage that, but build an entire system geared towards it, that's when the medium really shines. I don't want to imply here that games shouldn't deploy elements from other mediums. Metal Gear Solid and Death Stranding are both amazing games that heavily rely upon techniques taken from movies. The Call of Duty campaigns, kind of a guilty pleasure of mine, also feel like you're right in the middle of an action movie and you just have to kind of roll with the set piece. Incorporating these kinds of techniques and twisting them to fit alongside the inherent features of video games can lead to all new experiences and will ultimately help this art form grow. But there's also something to be said for developers that look at the inherent advantages to games, the ways in which narratives can emerge from the way games naturally function, and take full advantage of that. We could certainly be trying to develop a far more involving experience than the recent tendency of story-focused games to simply lead the player by the hand through their plots, having them simply follow someone who's explaining the story to them and just totally putting a backseat to the gameplay. Player stories have always existed and always will as long as we continue to engage with this medium. It's a fact that the Middle-earth games, for all their missteps, found a way to make use of, and I have no doubt that many more games in the future will build atop this foundation. Maybe the future Albert Wesker or Liquid Ocelot won't come from the typing fingers of an auteur game designer. Maybe they, like Azrans, will be hidden deep in the abyss of code and script that makes up their games. Is how I would have ended the video a couple of weeks ago. Over the last week, and in an incredibly unsettling case of synchronicity, the YouTuber Game Maker's Toolkit released a video talking about, well, the very same thing as this video. In their video, they talked about how Warner Bros. Actually has a patent pending for the Nemesis system, meaning that it may well show up in other Warner Bros. Games, but that other developers may face legal action for using similar ideas. Whatever your view on copyright may be, my stance is that the continued development of creative expression is absolutely important, and it would be awful to see such great potential forever locked away. Hopefully in the future we can see the Nemesis system rise once more in a new form, one that truly takes advantage of this medium, and leads to the creation of player stories that we'll remember for years to come. Thanks for watching everyone, I hope you enjoyed the video. This wasn't what I was planning to talk about this month, but I took a bit of a break over Christmas and I found this an easy thing to write to get my mind just back into producing these videos again. I've put a link to the Game Maker's Toolkit video in the description too, so check that out. It kind of freaked me out that we'd somehow thought to talk about the same topic at the same time, at a time where Shadow of War is just nowhere near relevant, but oh well. As a little fun activity, can you guys remember some of your own player stories where something crazy or compelling happened in any game that was just completely unscripted? Feel free to put them in the comments because I'd love to read them. For now, stay safe and I'll see you next time.